Close your eyes. I want you to leave this room, this moment, this year behind, and travel with me to a hot summer evening almost 200 years ago. It is June of 1822, Charleston, South Carolina. The heat does not break. Even after the sun goes down, the air is thick and wet and heavy with salt off the harbor. Spanish moss hangs motionless from the live oaks. The cobblestone streets still hold the warmth of the day, and from the great houses along the Battery comes the faint clink of silver and glass, the laughter of people who have never once in their lives been afraid. But down by the wharves, in the workshops and the kitchens and the slave quarters, something else is moving in the dark, something the men in those great houses cannot hear yet, something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to bury. In a small wooden house on Bull Street, a free black carpenter sits at a table by candlelight. He is a big man, broad across the shoulders from 30 years of labor, with gray beginning to thread his hair. There is a Bible open in front of him, and there are other men in the room, enslaved men. Men who slipped here through back alleys after dark, men who could be whipped for being out past the curfew bell. They are not here to pray, not only to pray. They are here because this carpenter has a plan so vast, so daring, so impossible, that the city of Charleston will refuse to even speak its full size out loud. Because by the accounts that survive, this one man had quietly drawn as many as 9,000 enslaved people into a single secret design: to rise up in one night and burn the largest slave-trading city in America to the ground. His name is Denmark Vesey, and in just a few weeks, he and dozens of others will be dead, hanged in secret, buried without markers, their names struck from the record by men who were terrified that the story itself might be contagious. Charleston did not just want to stop the rebellion. Charleston wanted to make sure you never heard about it at all. To understand how one freed carpenter nearly seized an entire city and why the people in charge were so desperate to erase him, you cannot start with the gallows. You have to start much earlier. You have to understand the boy who was sold across an ocean. You have to understand the lottery ticket that bought him his freedom, and the wife and children he could never buy out of chains. You have to understand the church they kept tearing down, and the revolution on a faraway island that lit a fire in his mind that no whip could ever put out. Because Denmark Vesey did not begin as a revolutionary. He began as a frightened child in the hold of a slave ship, listening to the sound of grown men weeping in the dark. This is the true story of Denmark Vesey, the free man who refused to be free while his people were not, and the secret he built in the heart of Charleston that an entire city tried to bury forever. Keep your eyes closed just a little longer, and let me take you back to where it began. Chapter 1. A boy sold across the sea. We do not know the exact day Denmark Vesey was born, or the name his mother first gave him. History did not think the birth of an enslaved child was worth recording. But we believe he was born around the year 1767, somewhere in the Caribbean or West Africa, and that as a boy he was bought and sold on the Danish island of St. Thomas. Picture that island. Turquoise water, white sand, green hills rising steep from the harbor. To a tourist's eye, a paradise. But beneath that beauty ran one of the cruelest engines on earth, the sugar economy, an industry that devoured human lives faster than almost any other in the world. And into that machine, a boy was sold. In 1781, when he was around 14 years old, he was purchased, along with 390 other captives, by a Bermudian slave ship captain named Joseph Vesey. The captain was carrying his human cargo to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the sugar island that the world would one day come to know by another name, Haiti. The boy stood out. He was unusually intelligent, strikingly handsome, alert, quick. The captain and his crew were taken with him. They gave him a new name, Telemach, after the son of Odysseus in the old Greek story. Over the years, in the mouths of Charleston, that name would slur and soften and shorten until it became the name history remembers him by. Denmark. But before he was Denmark of Charleston, he was Telemach in the hold of a slave ship. One frightened body packed among hundreds, in the dark, in the stench, in the heat, crossing waters that had already swallowed countless thousands who never reached the other side. When the ship reached Saint-Domingue, the boy was sold off with the others to a plantation. And then something happened that would change the course of his entire life. He fell ill, or appeared to. He began to suffer fits, what the records call epileptic seizures. To the planter who had just bought him, a sick slave was a bad investment, damaged goods. So the planter demanded his money back. And Captain Joseph Vesey, returning on his next voyage, was forced to take the boy back aboard his ship. Whether the illness was real, or whether a terrified 14-year-old had found a way to escape a plantation that would have killed him within a few years, no one will ever know for certain. But the result was this. The boy did not die in the cane fields of Saint-Domingue like so many did. Instead, he became the captain's personal slave, and for the next 2 years he sailed the Atlantic and the Caribbean at Joseph Vesey's side, watching the entire brutal business of human trafficking from the inside. Think about what that meant. This boy did not see slavery from a single plantation. He saw the whole system. He saw the ports. He saw the auctions in different tongues. He saw chained men loaded and unloaded like barrels of rum across an entire ocean. He learned languages. French, English, Spanish, and the Creole tongues of the islands. He learned to read. He learned numbers and trade and the ways of powerful men because he stood in the room while they made their deals. And somewhere in all those years at sea, watching his own people bought and sold in a dozen ports, a question must have begun to burn inside him. A question that the men around him never asked, because to them the answer was obvious. Why should it be this way? Why should this be allowed at all? That question would take 40 years to fully catch fire, but it was lit on the deck of a slave ship in the mind of a teenage boy, watching the world's cruelty up close and refusing, somewhere deep inside, to accept that it was right. In 1783, Captain Vesey gave up the sea. He settled down in a busy, growing port city on the coast of South Carolina, and he brought his young slave with him. The city was Charleston, and it would become the stage for everything that followed. To understand Denmark Vesey, you first have to understand Charleston, because there was no city in the United States quite like it. Charleston was beautiful, and Charleston was rich. Pastel mansions with deep porches, walled gardens heavy with jasmine, church steeples white against a blue sky, a harbor crowded with the masts of ships from every corner of the world. To the wealthy white families who ran it, it was one of the most elegant cities in all of America, and every single brick of that elegance had been laid by enslaved hands. Charleston was the great gateway of American slavery. Historians estimate that nearly half of all the enslaved Africans brought into what became the United States passed through the docks of this one region. They came chained in the holds of ships, and they were sold in pens and on platforms within sight of those beautiful church steeples. And here is the fact that haunted every white family in that city. The fact they almost never spoke aloud. The fact that lived under everything like a fault line under a city built on the coast. In Charleston and the surrounding Low Country, the enslaved black population did not just rival the white population. It vastly outnumbered it. In the rice and cotton districts around the city, black people outnumbered white people by as much as 9-1. Even in the city itself, the numbers were frighteningly close, and often black Charlestonians were the majority. Imagine living your whole comfortable life knowing that the people who cooked your food, raised your children, built your house, and emptied your chamber pots outnumbered you, surrounded you, and had every reason on earth to hate you. That is the secret terror that ran beneath all of Charleston's beauty. A terror of the very people they enslaved. A fear of the morning the numbers might finally turn against them. And so the whole city was built to hold that fear down. There were slave patrols that roamed the streets at night. There was a curfew bell, the St. Michael's bell, that told every black person, free or enslaved, when they had to be off the streets. There were laws against teaching the enslaved to read, laws against them gathering in groups, laws against them learning, organizing, praying together without a white person watching. Because the people in power understood something. They understood that a literate slave was dangerous, that an organized slave was dangerous, that a slave who could read the Bible for himself and find in it the story of a people led out of bondage was the most dangerous thing of all. And into this city, in 1783, walked a young man who could read, who could speak 5 languages, who had seen the whole machinery of slavery with his own eyes, and who carried inside him a question that would not die. Charleston had built a city to keep men like Denmark Vesey from ever existing. And he was already standing inside its gates. For 17 years, Denmark Vesey lived in Charleston as the slave of Captain Joseph Vesey. He was hired out, as skilled slaves often were, meaning his owner rented his labor and his skill to others and pocketed the wages. He worked, he watched, he waited, and he survived. And then, in the autumn of 1799, something almost unbelievable happened. Denmark Vesey won the lottery. It was a city street lottery, the East Bay Street Lottery, and against staggering odds, his number came up. The prize was $1,500, an enormous sum of money for the time, a fortune. Now, picture the cruelty wrapped inside that miracle. A man who was himself considered property, a man who could be bought and sold, had just won more money than most free white laborers would see in years. And he knew exactly what he was going to do with it. He went to his owner, and he bought himself. For $600, Denmark Vesey purchased his own freedom from Joseph Vesey on the last day of 1799. On December 31st, the last day of the old century, a man who had been carried across an ocean in chains as a boy became, in the eyes of the law, a free human being. Try to imagine the weight of that moment. The piece of paper, the signature, the single most precious document a person in his position could ever hold. Proof that he belonged to himself. He kept the rest of the money, around $900, and he started a new life. He set himself up as a carpenter, a skilled, respected trade. He was good at it. He worked hard, and he prospered. Within a few years, Denmark Vesey was one of the most successful free black men in all of Charleston. He owned property. He had his own business. He could read and write fluently in an age when most people, white or black, could not. People respected him. People listened when he spoke. By every measure the world offered a man like him, Denmark Vesey had made it. He had done the impossible. He was free, he was prosperous, he was respected. And here is the thing that makes his story so extraordinary, so unlike almost any other. He could not enjoy it. Because freedom, for Denmark Vesey, came with a wound that no amount of money could heal. He had a wife. He had children. And under the brutal law of South Carolina, a child inherited the status of its mother. His wife was enslaved, which meant his children were born enslaved. And he could not buy them out. Not because he lacked the money, though the price of a family was steep, but because their owners would not sell. A free man could be told no. A free man could stand there with cash in his hand and be refused the right to purchase his own wife, his own sons, his own daughters. So Denmark Vesey lived a torture few of us could imagine. He was free, and he watched his own children grow up as the property of other men. He could walk the streets a free man and then watch his family answer to an owner's bell. Every privilege he had won only sharpened the agony of what he could not win. And it taught him a lesson that would shape everything that came after. His own freedom meant nothing. Not really. Not while the people he loved were still in chains. Not while his children could be sold away from him at any moment, and he, a free man, would be powerless to stop it. A lesser man might have made his peace with it, might have kept his head down, enjoyed his comfort, and looked away. Denmark Vesey could not look away. He had spent his whole life unable to look away. And slowly, year by year, a conviction hardened inside him like iron cooling into a blade. If freedom could not be bought for everyone, then perhaps it would have to be taken. Every great movement needs a place to gather, a place where people can come together, speak freely, and dream out loud. For Denmark Vesey, that place was a church. In 1818, black Charlestonians, both free and enslaved, broke away from the white-controlled churches that segregated them, humiliated them, and forced them to worship as second-class souls. Together with a minister named Morris Brown, they founded their own congregation. It was affiliated with the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, the first independent black denomination in America, born in Philadelphia. They called it the African Church, and it grew with astonishing speed. Within a short time, its membership swelled to more than 4,000 people, making it one of the largest congregations of any kind in the entire United States. Picture what that church meant to the people who filled it. For a few hours, in that space, they were not property. They were not numbers in a ledger. They were a congregation, a community, a people, with their own preachers and their own songs and their own God who, they believed with all their hearts, had not made them to be slaves. And Denmark Vesey was one of its leaders, a class leader who taught and preached and read scripture to those who could not read it themselves. And here is where the most dangerous fire of all was lit. Because Denmark Vesey read the Bible, and he did not read it the way the slaveholders wanted it read. The white preachers loved one verse above all others. Servants, obey your masters. They repeated it endlessly, hammering it into the enslaved as the whole of Christian duty. But Denmark Vesey had read the rest of the book, and in it he found a very different story. He found the book of Exodus, the story of an entire enslaved people groaning under their bondage, whom God himself led out of Egypt and into freedom. He found the story of Joshua at the walls of Jericho. He read aloud the verse where the city is taken and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old. He told the people around him a truth the slaveholders had spent 200 years trying to hide from them, that the God of the Bible was not the God of the masters, that he was a God who hated bondage, that he had freed slaves before and could free them again. The white authorities of Charleston understood exactly how dangerous this was, and they moved against the church again and again and again. They raided its services. They arrested its worshippers for the crime of gathering. In 1818, they jailed more than 140 of its members. They harassed its leaders. They shut it down and watched it reopen and shut it down again. To the men who ran Charleston, 4,000 black people singing together about a God who freed the enslaved was not worship. It was a threat. It was an army that did not yet know it was an army. And every time they tore that church down, they taught Denmark Vesey the same lesson over again, that there would be no peaceful path, that the law would never let his people be free, that every door to freedom that opened by permission would be slammed shut by force. Somewhere in those years, the preaching became something more. The reading of Exodus became a plan. The congregation became a network, and the question that had burned in Denmark Vesey since he was a boy on a slave ship finally found its terrible answer. Not someday. Not by permission. Now, by their own hands. To understand why Denmark Vesey believed the impossible was possible, you have to understand one event that had shaken the entire world and terrified every slaveholder in the Americas to the core. Haiti. Remember Saint-Domingue, the French sugar island where the boy Telemaque was nearly sold to die in the cane fields? In 1791, the enslaved people of that island did the one thing the entire system existed to prevent. They rose up. All of them. At once. In the largest and most successful slave revolt in human history, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue overthrew their masters, defeated the armies of France, of Spain, and of Britain, the most powerful empires on earth, and in 1804 they founded a free black nation. They named it Haiti. For enslaved people across the Americas, Haiti was a thunderclap of hope. Living proof, written in blood and fire, that slavery was not eternal, that the masters were not invincible, that a chained people could break their chains and win. And for the slaveholders, for the men of Charleston, Haiti was their single greatest nightmare made real. They spoke of it in whispers. They banned newspapers that carried its story. They lived in terror that the fire of Haiti would leap across the water and land on their own shores. Denmark Vesey knew Haiti intimately. He had sailed those waters as a boy. He spoke the languages. And in his plan, Haiti was not just an inspiration, it was a destination. He believed that the free Black Republic would send ships, would offer refuge, would welcome the rebels of Charleston as brothers. Whether that hope was realistic or not, it was real to the men who followed him. And there was more fuel on the fire. In 1819 and 1820, the entire United States had been convulsed by a bitter, terrifying national argument over slavery. the crisis that ended in the Missouri Compromise. For the first time, enslaved people heard, drifting down from the great houses and the newspapers, that even powerful white men were now divided over whether slavery should exist at all. Denmark Vesey listened to all of it. The fire of Haiti, the cracks in the nation, the arguments of the powerful, and he drew a conclusion that the moment had come. The world was changing. The masters were afraid. The numbers were on his side. And he was not getting any younger. He was a free man, more than 50 years old, prosperous and respected, with everything in the world to lose. And he decided to risk all of it, his freedom, his fortune, his very life, for the people who had none of those things. Somewhere around 1821, Denmark Vesey stopped only dreaming and began to build. What he designed was not a riot. It was not a desperate, spontaneous lashing out. By the accounts that survive, it was a carefully organized military operation, planned over many months, with a structure, a chain of command, and a target. The target was Charleston itself, the whole city. The plan, as it was later described, was breathtaking in its ambition. On a chosen night, the rebels would strike all at once. They would seize the city's arsenals and guardhouses, where thousands of muskets and barrels of powder were stored. They would take the weapons. They would capture the city's defenses, and they would hold Charleston, the richest slave port in America, in their own hands. And after that, the plan grew darker and more total. The enslaved who worked in the great houses would rise against the families who owned them. The countryside would pour in, and if the city could not be held, the rebels would seize ships in the harbor and sail for Haiti, to freedom. It was, by some estimates, the largest slave uprising ever planned on American soil. And Denmark Vesey did not try to do it alone. Like any great general, he gathered around him a circle of trusted lieutenants, men of skill, of courage, and of fierce loyalty. There was Peter Poyas, a ship's carpenter, disciplined, brilliant, and utterly fearless. He was a master of secrecy, and he understood something the others sometimes forgot, that the greatest danger was not the white man's guns, it was loose talk. "Take care," Poyas warned the men he recruited, "and don't mention it to those waiting men who receive presents of old coats from their masters. They'll betray us." He understood that the slaves closest to their masters, the ones treated most gently, were the ones most likely to be loyal to them. It was a chillingly accurate insight. There was Monday Gell, an enslaved man who worked as a harness maker. He was literate, intelligent, and trusted. He kept lists, and he was said to have written letters reaching out for support. There were Rolla and Ned Bennett, enslaved men in the household of the governor of South Carolina himself, men who lived and worked at the very center of the state's power. Think about that. The plot reached into the home of the governor. The men who served his table were sworn to the rebellion. And there was one more lieutenant, the strangest, the most feared, and to the enslaved of the low country, perhaps the most powerful of them all. His name was Gullah Jack, and his weapon was not a musket. It was the spirit world itself. To understand Gullah Jack, you have to understand the Gullah people, the enslaved Africans of the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, who, more than almost anywhere else in America, had held on to their African languages, their customs, and their spiritual traditions. Gullah Jack, Jack Pritchard, was an Angolan. He had been brought to America already a man, already a conjurer, a priest of the old religion, what his people called an Angolan conjure man or spiritual doctor. And among the enslaved of the Low Country, his power was not doubted. It was feared, and it was revered. Denmark Vesey understood the genius of bringing such a man into the plot. Because Gullah Jack could do something Vesey, the Bible-reading carpenter, could not. He could reach the men whose faith was older than Christianity. He could speak to the deep ancestral fear of death. Gullah Jack gave the recruits charms to wear. They were described as crab claws and other tokens. He told them that if they held these charms in their mouths, the white man's bullets could not harm them, that they would be invincible in battle, that the spirits themselves were marching with the rebellion. Now, we may hear that today and think it's superstition, but put yourself in the mind of a man who is being asked to face armed soldiers with little more than his bare hands and a stolen blade. To know, deep in your bones, that the spirits of your ancestors have made you bulletproof, that is not a small thing. It is the difference between a man who hesitates and a man who charges. Between Denmark Vesey's Bible and Gullah Jack's charms, the rebellion had two faiths marching side by side: the Christian story of Exodus and the African power of the conjure man. Together, they reached almost every kind of believer in the enslaved community. And that was the secret of Denmark Vesey's organizing genius. He did not ask men to believe what he believed. He met every man where his courage already lived: in the church, in the spirits, in the love of family, in the simple, burning hatred of bondage. And he gave each of them a reason to rise. It was working. Month by month, name by name, the network spread out across the city and into the countryside like roots beneath the soil. How many people did Denmark Vesey draw into his secret? We will never know the true number for certain. The testimony was given under terror, and the records were written by the very men trying to destroy him. But the figures that came out of the investigation were staggering. Some witnesses spoke of 6,000, some of 9,000. The authorities themselves, in their darkest fears, spoke of a plot that reached for miles in every direction, into the plantations of the surrounding parishes. 9,000 human beings, bound to a single secret, in a city that executed people for far less than whispering about freedom. And the most astonishing part is not the number. It is the silence. For months, by some accounts for years, thousands of enslaved people knew that a rebellion was coming, knew names, knew dates, knew the plan. And the overwhelming majority of them said nothing. Not to the masters they served every day, not to the patrols, not to anyone with the power to stop it. That silence is one of the most powerful testimonies in all of American history. It is the sound of thousands of people who wanted freedom so badly that they were willing to gamble their lives on the discretion of thousands of others, and to keep faith with one another against everything the system could threaten. Picture the secret meetings. In the African church, after the White Watchers had gone. In Denmark Vesey's own house on Bull Street, the Bible open on the table. In workshops and stables and kitchens, in the brief stolen minutes between labor and curfew. Lists were kept and hidden, weapons were gathered. It was said that pikes and bayonets were being forged in secret by enslaved blacksmiths, and that hundreds of these blades were stockpiled. A free man, moving through the city in daylight as a respectable carpenter, carrying in his head the names of thousands and the keys to a coming storm. Speaking the right words to the right men, reading Exodus to those who could not read, sending word out to the plantations, building, quietly, patiently, the largest act of resistance the slaveholding South had ever faced. And he set a date chosen with deliberate, symbolic care. The rebellion would begin on the night of Sunday, July 14th, 1822. Bastille Day. The anniversary of the day the people of France stormed the great prison and lit the French Revolution. A date that meant the people rise and the old order falls. Sunday was chosen for a practical reason, too. On Sundays, enslaved people from the countryside were often permitted to travel into the city, to market, and to church. On that one day, a great gathering of black people in Charleston would raise no alarm at all. Everything was ready. The men were sworn, the blades were forged, the date was set. The largest slave rebellion in American history was just weeks away. And then, as it always seems to in these stories, it began to unravel. Not through the strength of the masters, but through the fear of a single frightened man. Take a breath with me here. Where in the world are you listening to this story from right now? Drop your country or your city in the comments below. I read every single one, and it means more than you know. And if Denmark Vesey's story is reaching you, please subscribe and turn on notifications so that these forgotten voices from history are never lost to silence again. Peter Poyas had warned them, don't mention it to those waiting men who receive presents of old coats from their masters. He had named the exact danger, and the exact danger is exactly what happened. Toward the end of May 1822, one of the conspirators made a fatal mistake. He approached an enslaved man named Peter, a house servant close to his master, treated kindly. He tried to bring him into the plot. And Peter did exactly what Poyas had feared. He was loyal, not to his people, but to the man who owned him. Frightened and conflicted, he carried the secret to a free black man he trusted, and together they carried it to Peter's master. And just like that, the secret of 9,000 people was in the hands of the enemy. But here is what is remarkable. At first, the authorities did not believe it. The plot was so vast, so audacious, so well hidden, that when the first warning reached the city officials, they could barely credit it. They questioned the men named, and they ran straight into a wall of disciplined, total silence. Peter Poyas and the other early suspects were arrested and interrogated, and they gave the authorities nothing. They were calm. They were innocent-seeming. They looked their accusers in the eye and denied everything so convincingly that the magistrates actually let some of them go. For a few days, the discipline of Denmark Vesey's lieutenants held the entire investigation at bay. Their silence was a fortress. But Vesey knew the secret was out. He knew the clock was now running against him, and so he made a desperate decision. He moved the date of the rebellion up, from July the 14th forward to the night of June the 16th. Strike now, before the city could prepare. But it was too late. Word of the new date could not reach all the scattered recruits in time. The countryside could not be mobilized overnight. The element of total surprise, the one thing that might have given a ragtag army of the enslaved a chance against an armed city, was gone. And then a second informant came forward, and a third. Slowly, under interrogation and the threat of death, the wall of silence began to crack. The city of Charleston, finally understanding the size of what had been planned in its midst, descended into pure panic. It was better with another positioned. The arsenals were reinforced. Federal troops were requested. The mask had slipped. For decades, the white families of Charleston had told themselves a comforting lie, that their slaves were content, even happy, that they were loved and loyal. Now, in a single week, that lie shattered. They learned that the men who shaved them, who cooked their meals, who rocked their children to sleep, who served at the governor's own table, had been planning to rise up and kill them. The terror that had always lived beneath the surface of Charleston came roaring up into the daylight. And a terrified people is a dangerous people. The arrests began in earnest. Dozens of black men, free and enslaved, were seized and thrown into the city's workhouse and jail. The interrogations turned harsh, then brutal. Men were threatened with death, with torture, with the destruction of their families unless they talked. And under that pressure, some of them broke. Names led to more names. The investigators began to assemble a picture of the conspiracy, its leaders, its structure, its terrible ambition. And one name rose above all the others. The name the frightened informants spoke with something close to awe. Denmark Vesey. On June the 22nd, 1822, they came for him. The free carpenter, the respected tradesman, the man who had bought his own freedom on the last day of the old century. They arrested him at the home of one of his wives, and they dragged him to the workhouse to stand before a secret court that had already decided he must die. What happened next was not a trial as we would understand the word. There was no public courtroom. There was no jury of the accused man's peers. There was instead a secret tribunal, a court of magistrates and freeholders, convened behind closed doors, its proceedings hidden from the public, the accused often not even permitted to face the witnesses against them. The men of Charleston were not interested in justice. They were interested in two things: stamping out the rebellion and controlling the story. Denmark Vesey defended himself. By the accounts that survive, he did so with formidable skill. He cross-examined witnesses. He picked apart testimony. He used the very literacy and intelligence that had made him a leader to fight for his life in a court designed to take it. But the verdict was never in doubt. It had been written before he ever entered the room. The court condemned him to death, and in their official sentence, the magistrates revealed exactly what frightened them most. They could not understand, or would not admit, why a free, prosperous, respected man would risk everything for others. They told him his plot was wild and visionary. They could not grasp that a man might value the freedom of his people above his own comfort and his own life. That was the thing Charleston could never forgive. Not just that he had plotted rebellion, but that he had proven with his own life that no kindness, no privilege, no scrap of comfort the system offered could buy the loyalty of a man who had truly understood what slavery was. And in the trials of the men around him, Charleston met something it could not break. This is the part of the story I most want you to remember. When the arrests came, the authorities expected the men to do what frightened, condemned people usually do: to beg, to bargain, to name others in exchange for their own lives. Some did, but others did something that has echoed down through 2 centuries. Peter Poyas, the ship's carpenter who had warned them all about the danger of loose talk, was tortured and interrogated for names. He gave them nothing, not one. And as he and his comrades were led toward the gallows, it was said that Poyas turned to the others and spoke words that have never been forgotten. Do not open your lips. Die silent, as you shall see me do. Die silent. Betray no one. Take the names to the grave. And he did. Peter Poyas went to his death without surrendering a single name of the many he surely knew. By his silence, he almost certainly saved lives, recruits whose names died with him. Denmark Vesey, too, by the accounts that survive, went to the end without breaking. He did not beg, he did not grovel. He had decided long ago what he was willing to die for, and when the moment came, he met it on his own terms. Think of the strength that took. To be condemned, to be doomed, to know that talking might ease your final hours, and to choose silence instead, to protect people you would never see again. That is not the courage of a single dramatic moment. That is courage held steady, breath by breath, all the way to the rope. On the morning of July the 2nd, 1822, Denmark Vesey was led to the gallows. With him were 5 of his lieutenants, including Peter Poyas. 6 men, hanged together, for the crime of imagining that they and their people might be free. And the killing did not stop there. Over the following weeks, the secret court continued its grim work. In the end, the numbers were staggering. By the close of the trials, the authorities had condemned 35 men to death and hanged them. Dozens more were sentenced to be sold and transported out of the country, exiled, torn from everything and everyone they knew, sent away forever. Gullah Jack, the conjure man whose charms were meant to make his followers bulletproof, was captured, condemned, and hanged. Monday Gell, who had kept the lists, was exiled. The leadership Denmark Vesey had so carefully assembled was wiped out, root and branch. Imagine the city in those weeks. The gallows working again and again. The black community of Charleston forced to absorb blow after blow. Fathers, husbands, sons, leaders, killed or carried away, one after another, in a campaign of terror designed to crush not just a rebellion, but the very idea of one. And when the executions were finally finished, the men of Charleston turned to their second great task, making sure it could never happen again, and making sure no one ever remembered that it had nearly happened at all. The response of Charleston, and of the entire slaveholding South, to the Denmark Vesey conspiracy tells you everything about how deeply it had frightened them. First, they destroyed the church. The African church, the great congregation of 4,000 souls where Vesey had preached Exodus, the heart of the black community, was blamed as the breeding ground of the plot. The authorities had it torn down. The building was demolished. The congregation was scattered and forbidden. The single greatest institution black Charlestonians had built for themselves was wiped from the map. But that church did not truly die. Its spirit went underground, and it endured. Generations later, it would rise again under a name the whole world now knows: Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, Mother Emmanuel. The same congregation in an unbroken line that the world would weep for in 2015. The roots of that church run straight back to Denmark Vesey. Second, Charleston armed itself against its own people. The state poured money into a new fortified arsenal and military academy built to defend the white population against the enslaved majority that surrounded them. That academy still stands today. We know it as the Citadel. Stop and absorb that. One of the most famous military colleges in America was born, in part, out of the sheer terror that Denmark Vesey had put into the hearts of Charleston's masters. Third, they passed new laws of breathtaking cruelty. The Negro Seaman Act required that any free black sailor whose ship docked in Charleston be jailed for the entire time the ship was in port, for the crime of being free and black and possibly carrying dangerous ideas from the outside world. They tightened the laws against teaching the enslaved to read. They cracked down on free black people, on gatherings, on movement, on everything. The whole society clamped down harder, grew crueler, more paranoid, more locked down, precisely because a single free carpenter had shown them how fragile their world really was. And then came the final move, the quietest and, in some ways, the most telling of all. They tried to erase him. Here is the great paradox at the heart of this story, the reason the title says that Charleston tried to hide it. The men of Charleston had two opposite fears, and they pulled against each other. On one hand, they wanted to publicize the trials, to justify the executions, to warn the enslaved of what awaited rebels. They published an official report of the proceedings, a document that, ironically, is one of the main reasons we know the story at all. But on the other hand, they were terrified of the story itself, terrified that the very idea of Denmark Vesey, a free black man who nearly took Charleston, was too dangerous to let live. They feared that if enslaved people across the South learned what had almost happened, it would not be a warning. It would be an inspiration. So they tried to control it, to minimize it, to bury the larger truth and let only the lesson of punishment survive. They wanted Denmark Vesey remembered, if at all, as a defeated criminal, never as what he truly was, a man who had looked the most powerful slave society in America in the eye and very nearly brought it down. And to a remarkable degree, for a very long time, it worked. For generations, the name Denmark Vesey was a footnote, or less, a story whispered in some places, suppressed in others, distorted almost everywhere. The largest slave conspiracy in American history was very nearly erased from the nation's memory, exactly as Charleston had wanted. And there is one more strange twist, one that historians still argue about today. Because the trial records were created by frightened, biased men extracting testimony under threat, some scholars have questioned how much we can truly know, even debating how large the conspiracy really was, or whether parts of it were exaggerated by the court's own terror. That debate is real, and it is honest, and it deserves to be acknowledged. But here is what is not in doubt. Denmark Vesey was a real man, a free black carpenter in the heart of the slaveholding South. Charleston put him to death, tore down his church, built a fortress against his people, and tried to bury his memory. You do not do all of that to a man who was nothing. You do that to a man you are afraid of, a man whose idea you cannot kill, no matter how many times you hang the body that carried it. Charleston tried to bury Denmark Vesey. History dug him back up. In the decades that followed, his name refused to stay silent. Abolitionists invoked it. When the Civil War came and black soldiers marched south to break slavery forever, some went into battle with a rallying cry on their lips. Remember Denmark Vesey of Charleston. Frederick Douglass himself spoke his name as one of the heroes of the long struggle for freedom. And in our own time, the recovery has gone further still. Historians wrote the books that pieced his life back together. The African church he helped found lives on as Mother Emanuel. And in 2014, nearly 2 centuries after Charleston tried to erase him, the city that hanged him unveiled a monument to Denmark Vesey, a statue standing in a Charleston park honoring the very man the city once tried to wipe from memory. Think about the long arc of that. The men who killed him are remembered now, if at all, only as his executioners. And the free carpenter they tried to bury in silence stands today, cast in bronze, in the very city that feared him. And there is one more thread, almost too heavy to speak. In 2015, a young white supremacist walked into Mother Emanuel, the church descended from Denmark Vesey's African church, and murdered 9 black worshippers during a Bible study. The same building in spirit, the same hatred in a new and monstrous form, nearly 200 years apart. The fight that Denmark Vesey gave his life to is not a closed chapter in a history book. It is a wound that is never fully healed. His story is not only the past. It reaches its hand directly into our present. And that is exactly why it must be remembered. Not buried, not whispered. Spoken, out loud, fully, and without flinching. Close your eyes one more time. Go back with me to that small wooden house on Bull Street on a hot summer night in 1822. The candle on the table, the Bible open in the flickering light. The men gathered in the dark, leaning in, listening. Men who knew that simply being in that room could cost them their lives. And at the center of them, a free man. A man who did not have to be there. A man who had already won the only prize the world said an enslaved person could ever hope for. His own freedom, bought and paid for, signed and sealed. That is the thing about Denmark Vesey that I cannot stop turning over in my mind. He was free. He was safe. He was prosperous and respected. By every measure the world offered, he had escaped. He could have lived out his years in comfort and looked away from everyone still in chains. And he refused. He refused because he understood something that the men who hanged him never could. That his freedom meant nothing while his children were owned by other men. That no person is truly free in a world built on the bondage of others. We tend to remember slavery as a story of helpless suffering, and there was suffering beyond what any of us can imagine. But Denmark Vesey reminds us of the other truth, the one Charleston tried so hard to bury, that the enslaved and the freed did not simply endure. They organized. They resisted. They planned and dreamed and dared and kept faith with one another in the dark against everything. 9,000 people, by some accounts, kept a single secret in a city that killed for far less. That is not the silence of the broken. That is the discipline of the determined. And so I want to leave you with the question that Denmark Vesey's life puts to all of us. Not, why did he do something so dangerous? The men in the secret court already asked that, and they could not understand the answer. The better question is this. What would it take for you to risk everything you had, your safety, your comfort, your very life, not for yourself, but for people you might never live to see go free? Denmark Vesey answered that question with his life. He gambled everything, and he lost. And they hanged him, and they tore down his church, and they tried to erase his name from the earth. And yet, here we are, nearly 200 years later, saying his name out loud, telling his story all the way to the end. The thing Charleston was most afraid of, that he would be remembered, that his idea would outlive his body, has come true after all. They buried the man. They could not bury the meaning. And as long as people are willing to listen to this story honestly, to feel it instead of looking away, Denmark Vesey will never again be the footnote a frightened city tried to make him. If this story has moved you, if it made you angry or made you proud or simply made you sit quietly and think, then please share it with someone. Someone you love needs to hear this. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay here with me as we keep returning again and again to the footnotes of history, to the people the world tried so hard to forget. Stories like Denmark Vesey's take many long days of careful research to tell with the accuracy and the dignity they truly deserve. If this story has moved you, you can support this work by buying me a single cup of coffee. The link is in the description, or just scan the code on your screen. Even one cup genuinely helps me keep researching, writing, and rescuing these forgotten people from being erased by history. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for being part of Footnotes of Fear. Thank you for listening, all the way to the very end. Take care of one another out there, and I will see you in the next story.